The engines came first. 15 black SUVs cutting through the bitter October wind like a convoy of nightmares, their headlights burning through the darkness outside the Valenti mansion at 11:47 in the evening. The sound was unmistakable, the low rumble of German machines worth more than entire houses, the synchronized crunch of tires on cobblestone, the hiss of hydraulic brakes settling into position like predators going still. Inside the security office, monitors cast their grey-blue glow across a face that had learned long ago not to show emotion. Giovanni Valenti sat motionless in his leather chair, watching the feeds from all 12 exterior cameras. His jaw was set. His dark eyes, sharp as broken glass, tracked every movement in the quadrants of his empire, the gates, the grounds, the service entrance where deliveries arrived. What he was about to witness would change everything. But he did not know that yet. Outside, the October wind tore through the cobblestones like a blade wrapped in ice. Dead leaves skittered across the marble columns that framed the iron gates of the Valenti mansion, twisted skeletal things that had forgotten what it meant to be green. The temperature had plummeted. The forecast had promised rain. Instead, the sky had gone perfectly clear and perfectly cruel, the kind of cold that burns your lungs when you breathe. Vivien Wells stood at the service entrance in her black and white maid uniform, the one she had worn for the past 6 months while scrubbing marble floors and making herself invisible to every person who mattered. She had no coat. She had no phone. She had been outside for exactly 4 minutes when the man collapsed against the iron gates. He was bleeding. The blood looked black against the pale stone in the moonlight, spreading slowly, with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. His breathing was shallow, ragged, the sound of a machine running out of fuel. He was dressed in a suit that had cost more than everything Vivien Wells owned in this world, but the suit meant nothing now because the suit was wet with blood and the man wearing it was dying. Vivien knelt beside him. She should have walked away. She should have gone back inside to finish her shift, to count the hours until midnight when she could leave and go to her second job at the diner where Preston Mercer would steal her tips and threaten her with termination if she complained. She should have thought about the eviction notice sitting on her kitchen table, the one with the red-inked deadline that said she had 5 days, to produce $22,000 or she and her 7-year-old daughter Sophie would be living in the streets. But instead, she reached into her apron pocket. Her hand closed around 5 crumpled $1 bills. $5. That was everything. That was the difference between eating tomorrow or going hungry. That was the thread holding her and Sophie in their apartment instead of under a bridge. That was the only money between her and the abyss. She pressed the bills into the dying man's frozen hand. "Get help," she whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling like a candle in the wind. "Please. Someone will help you. Just tell them you need help." The man's eyes, unfocused and glassy, seemed to register something. His lips moved. No sound came out. Blood continued to seep from his chest in a steady, patient rhythm, each drop a second slipping away that nobody could get back. Vivien was still kneeling there, still holding his hand, when the security camera mounted on the wall above captured everything in perfect, merciless detail. Inside the mansion, Giovanni Valenti watched the monitor. The black and white footage was grainy, but clear enough to see the details that mattered. The maid's trembling hands. The $5 disappearing into the bleeding man's grip. The way she knelt beside a stranger without hesitation, without calculation, without asking what he could give her in return. For a long moment, Giovanni did not move. Then he picked up the phone on his desk. When he spoke, his voice was steady, measured, solid like an oath carved into granite. One word, that was all he needed. "Marco." 30 seconds later, the phone rang again. "I am here, Signore." The service entrance. "There is a man on the ground. He is dying." The maid, the one who cleans the east wing, she gave him money. "Find out who she is." The line went silent. "Did you hear me, Marco?" "Yes, Signore. I heard you. But why would you?" "Find out who she is," Giovanni repeated, and the line went dead. Marco stood in the marble entry hall of the mansion, the phone still pressed to his ear, trying to understand what he had just heard. In 15 years, he had never heard Giovanni Valenti ask about a servant. He had never heard him show interest in anyone who was not connected to the family, to business, to power. The invisible people who cleaned and cooked and maintained his empire were exactly that, invisible. But someone had just made one of them visible. The footsteps in the marble corridor sounded like echoes of a dying man's last breath. Heavy. Deliberate. Approaching from the east wing with the pace of a funeral march. It was the young lieutenant, Luca, his suit immaculate, his expression carefully blank. What did he want? Luca asked. To know who the maid is, Marco said quietly. Luca's eyes widened. He opened his mouth. Closed it. In the space between those two moments, both men understood that something had shifted in the world they inhabited. Something that had been invisible was about to become visible. And that was never simple. That was never clean. Outside, on the cold cobblestones, the dying man's breathing had changed. It was shallower now. The $5 bills were still clutched in his frozen hand. Vivien Wells was still there, still kneeling, her uniform damp with blood that was not her own, her eyes closed, lips moving in words that nobody could hear. A prayer, maybe. Or a goodbye. Or both. The security camera recorded it all in grainy black and white, this moment that would become the hinge on which two broken lives would swing open, collide, and start the long journey toward something neither of them knew how to hope for. The wind continued to cut across the cobblestones. Dead leaves scattered like secrets trying to escape. And inside the mansion, in an office where power and darkness had made their home for so many years, Giovanni Valenti replayed the footage again. And again. And again. The question that formed in his chest was this: who is she that she has nothing left but is willing to give it to a stranger? But what Giovanni Valenti did not know, what he could not possibly have known as he watched that grainy footage loop and replay in the blue glow of the monitor, was that the dying man on the ground was Marco's younger brother, Danny. That Danny had been running from men far more dangerous than the Valentis. That he had been running toward Giovanni's territory hoping to find sanctuary. That he would not survive the night. And that $5 given by an invisible maid would set in motion a chain of events that would expose her to a world she had never imagined existed, a world of power and violence and love so fierce it could burn through the bars of a cage she didn't even know she was trapped in. Now, let us go back. Back to 2 days earlier, to the moment when Vivien Wells was still trying to become invisible, still trying to make herself small enough that the cruelty of the world might pass her by without noticing. Back to the beginning. Back to where everything was still broken, but had not yet been shattered into the pieces that would finally be rearranged into something whole. The alarm on Vivien's phone went off at 5 in the morning. 5:03, to be exact. She had set it for 5, but her phone was cheap and old and nothing about it worked correctly anymore. She had owned it for 3 years, which meant she was 3 years into making the smallest possible payments to keep service active, 3 years of watching the screen crack wider, 3 years of the battery dying at random moments with no warning. She woke in the darkness of her studio apartment, not a bedroom, a studio, a single room where she and Sophie slept in a bed that took up most of the floor space, where the kitchen was a hot plate on a shelf, where the bathroom was so small you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms out. Sophie was still asleep, her small body curled into a question mark under a blanket that had been mended so many times it was more stitching than fabric. Her breathing was soft, peaceful. She had no idea yet that her mother was running out of time. Vivien sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 60 seconds. She allowed herself 60 seconds each morning to feel the weight of everything before she had to stand up and start moving, and then she swung her legs over the side and let her feet find the cold floor. The eviction notice was still on the kitchen shelf where she had left it. She did not want to read it again, but she read it anyway, because punishment was a form of motivation and she needed to be motivated. The words were the same as they had been yesterday and the day before that: eviction proceedings initiated, 12 days to vacate the premises, $22,000 to halt the process, contact your attorney immediately, your case has been assigned to court docket number 74392. $22,000. She made $12.50 an hour scrubbing marble floors in the Valenti mansion. She made $9 an hour working the night shift at Sal's diner. That was 40 hours a week at the mansion, assuming she did not miss a single shift, assuming she did not get sick, assuming Preston Mercer did not find an excuse to fire her. That was 40 hours a week at the diner on top of that, which meant 80 hours a week, which meant she was awake and working, in theory, 80 hours out of every 168. $22,000 divided by 80 hours meant she needed to keep $275 per week. She was currently keeping approximately 60. The mathematics of desperation were so perfectly simple that they hurt to think about. No housing assistance would help her. No food stamps. No emergency loans. The landlord had already rejected her pleas. The bank had rejected her requests. The world had many systems designed to help poor people stay poor, but no systems designed to help poor people stop being poor. Sophie stirred in bed, her small hand reaching out in sleep, searching for her mother's warmth. Vivien touched her daughter's forehead gently, carefully, the way you touch something fragile that might break. Sophie's skin was warm. Good. No fever. She was healthy, which was the only thing that mattered. Everything else was negotiable. Health was not. She pulled on her work clothes, the grey uniform she wore when she left for the mansion at 6 in the morning, the black and white maid uniform she changed into once she arrived. She braided her hair. She brushed her teeth using the same toothbrush she had used for 2 years, the bristles now splayed and ineffective, but functional enough. She did not look in the mirror. She had learned not to look at herself. Looking at yourself when you were at the bottom of the world was counterproductive. At 5:52, she left Sophie with Mrs. Chen, the neighbor who kept her daughter during work hours for $30 a day, which was $30 Vivien did not have but somehow found anyway, because some debts had to be paid immediately or your child ended up in a foster system that was no kinder than poverty. The bus to the Valenti mansion took 41 minutes. She knew this because she had timed it 100 times, looking for ways to shave seconds off her day, to find gaps where she could fit another task, another shift, another desperate attempt to make the mathematics of her life work. The mansion sat on 6 acres in the most expensive neighborhood in Philadelphia, behind iron gates that had been forged in Italy in 1887, gates that had cost more than some people's homes. The building itself was a study in excess, marble columns, soaring ceilings, windows that looked out on grounds that employed a full-time groundskeeper, a chef, 3 housekeeping staff, and security personnel who moved through the halls like ghosts carrying weapons you were not supposed to know they had. Vivien was one of the 3 housekeeping staff. She had worked for Giovanni Valenti for 6 months, and in that time, he had never once looked at her. Not once. She had seen him in the hallways exactly twice. Both times his eyes had passed through her like she was made of glass, like she was furniture that had somehow learned to move and clean and then arrange itself in the corner again when he needed to think. This was intentional. She had learned to be invisible. It was a survival skill. If they noticed you, they could fire you. If they fired you, everything collapsed. She changed into her uniform in the staff room, which was a small space where 3 women tried to exist without taking up too much air. Her co-workers barely acknowledged her. Maintenance of distance was another survival skill. The East Wing was her responsibility. 16 rooms, 42 hallways, 212 windows, marble floors that needed to be scrubbed without leaving streaks, without making noise, without disturbing the silence that seemed to matter more than cleanliness. She had been scrubbing the same hallway for 3 hours when she heard the commotion near the front gates. Men's voices. Shouting. The sound of vehicle doors slamming. She paused her work, her hand still gripping the handle of the mop, and listened. The sounds continued for another minute, then stopped. Whatever had happened was over. Whatever crisis existed in the world beyond these walls was no longer her concern. She returned to the marble floor, pushing the mop back and forth in the hypnotic rhythm that had become the texture of her days. At 3 in the afternoon, her shift ended. She changed back into her grey uniform and caught the bus to Sal's diner, a place where the fluorescent lights hummed with the frequency of low-level suffering and the coffee had the flavor of something that had been burned and then burned again. Preston Mercer was there, as he always was. 47 years old, carrying 50 pounds more than his body could comfortably support, wearing a manager's shirt that had sweat stains in the armpits that no amount of washing could remove. He had worked at Sal's for 19 years. He had authority over 7 people and used that authority the way a child uses a stick to poke at things that cannot escape. "You're late," he said when she clocked in. "I am 6 minutes early," she said quietly. "Did I ask you to talk back? You take 3 tables. Do not take more than 3. And smile. Customers do not want to see sad. Sad does not sell." She pasted a smile onto her face. It felt like a mask, which it was. Everything was a mask. Everything was performance. The invisible maid. The pleasant waitress. The woman who had learned to compress herself down to the smallest possible version of herself so that she could fit into the spaces where survival was possible. During her shift, Preston stole from her tips. Not all of them. Just enough to be noticeable. $40 she had earned. $30 she left with. The missing 10 was a message. The message was, "I own you, and I can take whatever I want, and there is nothing you can do about it." Vivien did not report him. Reporting him would get her fired. Getting fired would mean no paycheck, and no paycheck meant eviction in 5 days instead of 12. At 11 in the evening, her shift ended. She had another shift in the morning. There were always 2 shifts. Sometimes 3. There was no such thing as a day off because a day off meant no money and no money meant the timeline of her eviction accelerated. She took the bus back to her apartment. Mrs. Chen was asleep in the chair when she arrived, Sophie curled against her like a small cat. Vivien paid her, helped her to the door, and then she stood in the darkness of her studio apartment and did the mathematics again. $22,000. 12 days. No plan. No hope. No visible path forward that did not end in catastrophe. She lay down next to Sophie and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep, because sleep was a luxury and she did not have money for luxuries. At 5:03 in the morning, her alarm went off again. She had been awake for 84 hours. She climbed out of bed and started the machinery of survival again. The marble floor stretched like a frozen lake, endless and gleaming under the morning light that poured through the mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows. Vivien Wells moved across it on her knees, her cloth moving in methodical circles, the bucket of soapy water beside her releasing wisps of steam into the cold air. She was 26 years old, though her eyes belonged to someone much older, the kind of eyes that had counted money too many times and always found it insufficient. Her hands were calloused, the skin around her knuckles cracked and red from the chemicals that burned them clean every single day. The black and white uniform hung loose on her frame. She had not eaten breakfast. There was nothing to eat. There had been nothing to eat for 2 days except the half sandwich a customer had left on a plate at the restaurant, the one she had scraped into a container and saved for Sophie. Around her, the mansion breathed with a different kind of life. Guards moved through the halls in tailored black suits, their shoes clicking against the marble with a confidence that came from carrying power in their shoulders and weapons under their jackets. They did not look at Vivien. She was part of the architecture, as invisible as the baseboard she scrubbed, as present and unnoticed as the air they breathed. This was how she survived in spaces like this. She made herself smaller. Quieter. She became a ghost, faithful and obedient, the kind of ghost that could be fired without consequence. Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, barked an order from across the foyer without glancing in Vivien's direction. Move faster. The East Wing needed attention. There were guests coming tonight, though Vivien was not supposed to know this. She only knew because she listened. Listening was free. It was the only intelligence she could gather in a world where information meant survival. Vivien did not respond. She simply redirected the bucket, her movements fluid, practiced, invisible. Her shift had started at 6 in the morning. It would end at 2 in the afternoon. Then she would have 4 hours to change clothes, take the bus across the city, and arrive at Mazzini's restaurant by 6 o'clock for the night shift that would not end until midnight or later, depending on how many tables Preston Mercer decided to seat in her section. The clock on the wall above the grand staircase read 11:58. 2 hours remained. She counted them in her mind the way she counted everything: money, minutes, meals, the days until her life ended in catastrophe. At exactly 2 o'clock, Vivien changed out of her uniform in the staff bathroom, which was smaller than a closet and smelled like industrial cleaner and despair. She folded the black and white dress carefully, placed it in her bag, and pulled on the burgundy shirt that was the uniform for Mazzini's. It was stained near the collar from someone's wine 2 days ago. She had tried to scrub it out. The stain remained. The bus ride across Philadelphia took 35 minutes. She sat by the window and watched the city transform around her, the Valenti mansion's opulent neighborhood giving way to streets where the buildings leaned toward each other like tired old men, where the sidewalks were cracked and the storefronts had security gates that came down after dark. This was her neighborhood. This was where she belonged. Mazzini's was on a corner between a laundromat and a check-cashing place. It was the kind of restaurant that tried to look upscale and almost succeeded if you did not look too closely at the grout between the tiles or the burn marks on the kitchen stainless steel. Vivien arrived at 5:55 and clocked in at 5:56. Punctuality was the one thing she could control. Preston Mercer was waiting for her near the bar. She knew he would be. He was always waiting, a spider positioned at the center of his web, ready to extract something from anyone who passed through. He was 43 years old, with thinning hair that he tried to hide by keeping it slicked back, and cologne that announced his arrival in a room 30 seconds before his body followed. His eyes were the color of wet concrete, and they looked at Vivien the way a man looks at something he owns. "Wells," he said, his voice dropping into that particular register that meant nothing good. "We need to talk about last week's tips." Vivien felt her stomach contract. She had earned $140 in tips over 7 days. She had written it down. She had counted it 3 times to make sure. $140. That was the difference between eating and not eating. That was Sophie's lunch money for next week. "Mr. Mercer, I need to start my section," she said quietly. "We're going to get busy. Are you refusing to talk to me?" His voice remained calm, but something dangerous moved behind his eyes. "Because I can find someone else who won't refuse me. Someone who understands that when a manager asks to speak with an employee, the employee speaks. You understand that, don't you?" She understood. She understood that her job existed in the margin between survival and eviction. She understood that Preston Mercer controlled that margin. She understood that refusal was a luxury she could not afford. "Yes," she said. "I understand." "Good. Company policy requires tip redistribution among the entire staff. The tips you earned last week need to be redistributed. I'll be taking them and dividing them fairly." "That's not," the words started to come out before she could stop them. "That is not legal. That is not fair. That is theft. Are you questioning my authority?" His voice remained quiet, but it had the quality of a blade now, sharp and dangerous. "Because I can find someone else who won't question me. There are 20 women who would take your shift tomorrow. I need to know right now, are you going to be a team player, or are you going to be a problem?" Vivien swallowed. The words went back down her throat like glass. "I'll be a team player," she whispered. "Good. $140. That's what I need from you. I'll be by tomorrow to collect it." He smiled then, and it was the smile of someone who had just won something, though what he had won was only money that did not belong to him and the satisfaction of watching someone smaller than him realize they had no choice. "Now get to work. You have customers." She had customers. She always had customers. She spent the next 6 hours moving between tables, pouring water, taking orders, delivering plates of pasta and chicken piccata and risotto, smiling at people who did not see her, existing in the margins of their evenings. When a customer left a $20 tip, she felt a spike of hope. When another left nothing at all, she felt the weight of the mathematics that would not work. At midnight, she clocked out with $43 in her pocket. The $140 was gone, redistributed by Preston Mercer into his own redistribution system, which meant his own pocket. The bus ride home took 40 minutes at this hour. The streets were emptier, the city smaller and more dangerous in the way that late-night cities are. Vivien sat in the back and counted the money in her wallet, $43 and some change. That was all. $43 to last until her next paycheck, which would come in 8 days, which would be 5 days too late. Mrs. Chen was asleep in the chair when Vivien arrived at her apartment, Sophie curled against her like a small animal seeking warmth in the cold. Vivien paid her $50 that she did not have, and Mrs. Chen woke up slowly, gathering herself, moving toward the door with the careful steps of someone whose own life was a series of necessary sacrifices. She was good, Mrs. Chen said. No trouble. Thank you, Vivien said, and meant it in a way that went deeper than words could reach. She helped Mrs. Chen to the door, locked it behind her, and stood in the darkness of her studio apartment. The space was maybe 200 square feet. There was a bed that she shared with Sophie, a small table, a kitchenette with a refrigerator that hummed constantly. There was a window that looked out onto the street below, where a siren wailed past every hour or so, the soundtrack of neighborhoods where bad things happened regularly and nobody was surprised anymore. On the table lay the envelope. She had been avoiding looking at it, but avoidance was the privilege of people who had choices. The red lettering screamed at her, eviction notice. 12 days remaining. Amount due, $22,000. $22,000. Vivien sat down at the table and opened the envelope again, though she had already read it 7 times. The words did not change. The deadline did not extend. The amount did not decrease through the sheer force of her desperation. She did the mathematics again, the way she did every night. $22,000 divided by 12 days equaled approximately $1,833 per day. She made $43 a day on average. Her rent was $800 a month, which meant it was eating 70% of her income before she had even bought food or paid for childcare or kept the lights on. She had borrowed against her future so many times that her future was now something that belonged to other people. There was no path forward that did not end in catastrophe. There was no solution. There was only the clock moving forward and the deadline approaching like a wall she was driving toward at full speed. Sophie stirred in her sleep. Vivien looked at her daughter's face, peaceful and trusting, and felt something break inside her chest. She lay down beside Sophie without undressing. She held her small body close and stared at the ceiling and thought about the things she could no longer provide. A home. Safety. The simple knowledge that tomorrow would be survivable. At 5:03 in the morning, her alarm went off. She had not slept. She never slept anymore. Sleep was a luxury, and she was no longer in the market for luxuries. She climbed out of bed carefully, so as not to wake Sophie, and started the machinery of survival again. Change clothes. Wash her face. Drink water instead of coffee because coffee costs money. Take the bus. Arrive at the Valenti mansion. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in a room lined with mahogany and shadows, Giovanni Valenti sat at the head of a table surrounded by men who feared him. The table itself was worth more than Vivien would earn in 5 years of work. The chairs were imported leather. The light that came through the windows was filtered through curtains that cost more than her annual rent. Giovanni was 41 years old. He was 6'2", with a build of someone who had started as muscle and evolved into command. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored so precisely that it seemed like a second skin, and it was worth $4,000. He wore a watch on his left wrist that cost more than a car. A scar ran along his jaw from his ear to his chin, a souvenir from a betrayal he had long since stopped thinking about. Or rather, a betrayal he thought about constantly but had learned to compress into the smallest corner of his mind, where it burned like a candle that would never go out. His brother had done that to him. Not the scar. The scar had come from someone else, from the early days when Giovanni was still learning that trust was a weakness. The real wound, the one that never healed, had come from his own blood. 5 years ago, his brother Michael had sold their family shipping empire to the Torino family, their oldest rivals. He had done it for money. He had done it for reasons that Giovanni had never fully understood and had stopped trying to. What mattered was that Michael had chosen betrayal, and betrayal had consequences, and consequences had to be delivered by someone, and Michael's body had never been found, and Giovanni had taken control of what remained, and he had spent the last 5 years building an empire on top of blood and broken trust. "The Torino shipment is coming through on Tuesday," Marco said. He was Giovanni's oldest lieutenant, the man who had been with him since the beginning, the one person Giovanni had allowed to live this long without question. 16 kilos. High grade. "How many men do they have?" Giovanni asked. 8. Maybe 10. "We take them." Giovanni's voice was flat, emotionless. "Take the shipment. Leave no one alive. I want to send a message." Marco nodded. This was the business. This was the empire. This was what happened when you forgot that mercy was a weapon that could be turned against you. "The mansion needs to be cleaned tomorrow," Giovanni said, and his attention shifted away from the Torino family and the Tuesday shipment and moved toward a detail so small it barely registered. "Make sure the new girl, whatever her name is, doesn't touch my office. I don't want anyone in there." "Yes, boss," Marco said. Giovanni did not ask for her name. He did not care what her name was. She was part of the machinery of his life, no more significant than the furniture or the paintings on the walls. She existed to serve a function, and when her function was complete, she would cease to exist in any meaningful sense. This was how he had learned to think about people. It was safer. It was cleaner. It was the only way to survive in a world where everyone betrayed you eventually. He did not know that this woman, whose name he did not know, was at that very moment scrubbing the marble floors of his mansion with hands that were bleeding at the knuckles. He did not know that she had $5 in her pocket. He did not know that her daughter was waiting in a neighbor's apartment for her to return. He did not know that in 4 days, everything would change, and the change would begin with the worst blizzard Philadelphia had seen in a decade, and an act of mercy that would crack the ice around his heart. The wind outside cut like a blade wrapped in ice. Vivien Wells pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the restaurant's back door, watching the sky turn the color of a bruise. November had arrived early and vicious, bringing with it the kind of cold that made your lungs burn with each breath. It was 3:36 in the afternoon. She had been standing for 8 hours straight. Her feet throbbed inside shoes held together with electrical tape and prayer. The dinner shift had not even started yet. She pulled her pocket open and counted the bills inside her apron one more time. $5. That was everything between her and nothing. $5 to feed herself and Sophie for the next 3 days. $5 until Friday, when Preston Mercer would, maybe, pay her the wages he owed her, minus whatever he decided to steal this time. The cold pressed harder against the glass. The weather forecast this morning had warned about a blizzard rolling in by evening, temperatures dropping to 15 degrees, wind chill below zero. Vivien owned no winter coat. She had sold it 2 months ago to pay for Sophie's medicine, the kind the 6-year-old needed for her asthma, the kind that cost more than Vivien made in a week. She heard footsteps behind her. Heavy. Deliberate. Slow. "You taking a break?" Preston Mercer's voice came with coffee breath and menace. He was 51 years old but carried himself like a man used to taking what he wanted from people smaller than himself. His uniform shirt strained across his belly, and his wedding ring caught the fluorescent light as he pointed one thick finger at the clock on the wall. "You've got 10 minutes. Not 11. Not 12. 10. "Yes, Mr. Mercer," Vivien said without turning around. She had learned long ago that eye contact was dangerous. Eye contact meant he could see her, and if he saw her, he would find something to punish her for. The footsteps receded. She waited until she heard the walk-in freezer close before she moved. Outside, the temperature had dropped at least 3 degrees since morning. The eviction notice sat in her other pocket, folded and refolded so many times the paper had started to tear along the creases. Red ink. 12 days remaining. The landlord's signature at the bottom like a death sentence written in careful cursive. 12 days. She had counted them every morning for the past month. Counted and recounted as if different numbers might appear if she was desperate enough. Counted them again this morning while Sophie ate the last of the oatmeal and asked if they could afford honey this week. No, baby, Vivien had said, braiding her daughter's hair with fingers that remembered having steadier hands. But the oatmeal is sweet all by itself, right? It's like nature's honey. Sophie was 6 years old and already learning to lie. Already learning to pretend. The weight of that knowledge sat in Vivien's chest like a stone. The blizzard warning meant she needed to get to the corner store before the roads became impassable. Bread. Milk if she could stretch the $5. Maybe eggs. The math was already running in her head, the desperate arithmetic of poverty that consumed every waking moment. $2 for a loaf of bread. $1 for milk. $2 for a dozen eggs. She was already at $5 and she had not even accounted for transportation or. The blast of wind knocked her sideways. She had not realized how much time had passed. The temperature had plummeted like a stone dropped into dark water. The sky was no longer bruised. It was the color of a coffin lid being sealed. She wrapped her arms around herself. Her uniform was thin, designed for indoor work in climate-controlled environments. It provided no protection. No mercy. No warmth. The wind gusted again, carrying with it the first real snow, heavy and vicious and falling so thick she could barely see the street beyond the gates. Within minutes, the sidewalk disappeared under white. Within minutes more, the world became a void. Her phone was dead. She could not afford to pay the bill this month, not with the eviction notice and Sophie's medicine and the rent already 2 weeks late. The closest store was 3 blocks away. 3 blocks in weather that was dropping toward freezing with every passing moment. She should go back inside. Every rational thought screamed at her to turn around, to go back through that door, to accept defeat and give up on bread and milk and the small dignity of being able to provide dinner for her daughter tonight. But Sophie was waiting in Mrs. Chen's apartment downstairs, a borrowed space that Mrs. Chen had stopped charging for, though Vivien knew her elderly neighbor was eating less because of it. Sophie was waiting and Vivien had promised her daughter that today would be different. Today they would have something warm. Today they would not eat the leftover rice mixed with water from last night. Vivien stepped away from the building. The cold swallowed her immediately, absolute and suffocating. Her breath came in visible clouds. Her fingers began to go numb within seconds. The snow was already halfway up the sidewalk and still falling, still multiplying, still erasing the world. She made it 1 block. Her feet moved on autopilot, muscle memory, the body carrying forward when the mind had surrendered. She made it to the 2nd block. The wind had become sentient, it pushed at her, trying to knock her down, trying to convince her to stop moving, to sit down, to give up. That was when she saw him. He was collapsed against the iron fence that marked the boundary of Giovanni Valenti's estate. A man, maybe 60 years old, his face grey with something beyond cold. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading, soaking into the white snow like poison into water. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing, seeing nothing, already halfway gone. Every instinct screamed at Vivien to keep walking. This was danger. This was police involvement and questions and complications her life could not absorb. This was the kind of moment that could cost her everything if she made the wrong choice. She knelt in the snow beside him anyway. His lips had turned the color of slate. His breathing was shallow, barely visible, a last echo of something that was leaving. She pulled off her gloves, what good were they, really, when her hands were already numb, and pressed them against the wound in his side. The blood was still warm. He was still alive. "Help is coming," she whispered, though she had not called anyone, did not have a phone that could call anyone. "Someone will come. You're not alone." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the $5. Her hand shook as she pressed the bills into his frozen palm. His fingers did not close around them. She had to fold his hand herself, pressing his own flesh around the money like a prayer. "I don't have much," she said. Her voice was breaking now. "But take this. Get help. Someone will see you. Someone will come." She ran. Her feet carried her back toward the mansion, back through the servants' entrance, back into warmth and light and safety. Her hands left a trail of blood across the marble floor that had been cleaned hours ago by people the world forgot existed. The staff phone was mounted on the wall beside the kitchen. She dialed 911 with fingers that would not obey her brain. They kept slipping, kept making mistakes, kept having to dial twice, 3 times, 4 times before the numbers lined up correctly. 911, what is your emergency? There's a man, Vivien gasped. Outside of the Valenti estate on Rittenhouse Square. He's been stabbed. He's not breathing right. He's dying. She gave the address. She gave what information she had. She stayed on the line until the dispatcher assured her an ambulance was already rolling. Then she hung up and sank onto the floor, her back pressed against the cold wall, her heart hammering like it wanted to escape her chest. She did not know that 28 floors above her, in an office lined with dark wood and darker secrets, Giovanni Valenti sat watching security monitor footage with eyes that had learned to see everything and feel nothing. She did not know that the man bleeding out in the snow was Marco's brother. She did not know that Giovanni watched the timestamp change from 11:45 to 11:46 to 11:13 p.m. She did not know that he watched her kneel beside a dying stranger, watched her give away everything she had, watched her run. She did not know that something cold and dangerous stirred in his chest. Something that had been dead for 5 years. Something that moved. She did not know that Giovanni picked up the phone and said, quietly, with a voice like distant thunder, "Find out who she is. Find out everything." And meanwhile, in a corner office downtown, Margaret Harrington sat in her perfectly appointed study, updating her social calendar on an iPad that cost more than Vivien would make in a year, completely unaware that her world was about to be shattered by a maid who existed to be invisible. The snow continued to fall. The city continued to sleep. And in the space between one moment and the next, everything changed. The office was so quiet you could hear the snow falling outside, each flake striking the floor-to-ceiling windows like tiny accusers. Vivien Wells stood in the center of Giovanni Valenti's study, her worn dress, the only decent one she owned, still damp at the hem from walking through the Philadelphia slush. 28 floors below, the city sprawled in shades of gray and white. Up here, in a room lined with dark mahogany and leather that smelled like old money and older power, everything felt suspended in time. Giovanni sat behind his desk, not looking at her, his attention fixed on papers that bore names she did not recognize. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair silvered at the temples and a scar that ran from his left eye down to his cheekbone like a map of a war she would never fully understand. His suit, charcoal, tailored, worth more than 6 months of her wages, hung on him like it had been sewn into his skin. A gold watch caught the light on his left wrist. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply existed in the space between her poverty and his empire, and the distance felt unbridgeable. "The $22,000, he said finally, his voice like distant thunder rolling across an empty sky. "It's handled. The eviction notice is void. You and your daughter are safe." Vivien could not breathe. Her lungs had forgotten how. The air felt thick, concrete heavy, impossible to pull into her chest. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. I can't accept that. I can't pay you back. There's no way I could ever. I'm not asking you to. Giovanni turned then, standing slowly, each movement controlled and deliberate like a predator that had learned patience the hard way. He walked to the window and placed his palm flat against the glass. "My brother betrayed me 5 years ago. Sold our family to our enemies. I had to choose between mercy and survival. I chose survival, and it turned me into something I don't recognize anymore." He turned to face her. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and in them she saw something that looked like drowning. I haven't felt anything, truly felt anything, in 5 years. Until I watched you give $5 to a dying stranger when you had exactly $5 to your name. I watched you call an ambulance for a man you will never meet again. I watched you run through the snow without a coat because you were terrified, but you still made that call. The words hung between them like weapons neither knew how to use. Vivien felt her eyes burning, but she would not cry. Not here. Not in front of him. I'm not a good person, she whispered. I've thought about giving up 100 times. Last week I stood on the bridge near my apartment and wondered if Sophie would be better off without me dragging her down. She did not know why she said it. The words simply came, spilling out like blood from a wound. The memory was there suddenly, rain soaking through her thin jacket, her hand shaking on the cold metal railing, the dark water below promising an end to the exhaustion, the fear, the endless struggling. 20 minutes she had stood there, doing the mathematics of her own erasure. Sophie could go to her aunt in Pittsburgh. Sophie would have better. Sophie would not have to watch her mother fail over and over, penny after penny, day after day. Her phone had buzzed. A text from Sophie's school about a field trip permission slip. $15. She did not have $15. She did not have 5. The void had pulled at her, and the railing had been so cold beneath her palms. Then another buzz. A photo from the neighbor. Sophie holding up a crayon drawing, her stick figure mother-rendered in impossible colors, yellows and pinks and bright, bright blue. I love you, Mama. You are my hero. Vivien had stepped back from the railing. She had walked home in the rain. She had kept fighting. Sometimes survival is not about being strong, she said aloud now, in Giovanni's study 28 floors above the city. Sometimes it's about one tiny thing that reminds you why you cannot quit. Giovanni watched her with an expression she could not name. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It sounded softer, like someone speaking to a child who was terrified of the dark. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only love can do that. And you, Vivien Wells, are full of it. She had no time to respond. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, rapid and urgent. A man burst through the door, not Marco, but Luca, Giovanni's second lieutenant, his face flushed red with anger or fear or both. Boss. Preston Mercer. He's downstairs. Says he wants to talk, but he's armed. He's drunk. He's making threats. Giovanni's entire body went still. The softness in his voice evaporated like rain on hot concrete. Where is he? Basement level. We've got 6 men watching him. He won't move, but he won't leave either. And Margaret Harrington. Her lawyers sent papers this morning. False loan claims. $12,000 she says Vivien owes. They've also filed a CPS complaint. Anonymous report of child neglect. There's an inspection scheduled for this afternoon at Vivien's apartment, and... Enough. Giovanni moved to his desk and picked up the phone. His fingers moved across the buttons with practiced precision. Get Vivien's daughter. Bring her here. Full security detail. No one touches her. No one even looks at her without permission. He hung up and turned back to Vivien. Your daughter is safe. Everything else will be handled. Do you understand? What are you going to do? The question came out like a prayer or a curse. She did not know which. Giovanni did not answer. He simply walked past her toward the door, his suit jacket swallowing the light. At the threshold, he paused. Stay in the guest house. Marco will be outside your door all night. Tomorrow morning, you'll understand. The door closed behind him, and Vivien was alone in the office that cost more to rent per month than she had made in a year. Outside, the snow continued falling. In the hallway, she heard his footsteps receding, the elevator doors opening, the soft hiss as he descended into whatever came next. 3 blocks away, In a corner office that smelled like rose water and old money, Margaret Harrington hung up her phone and smiled. The smile was thin, sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. Everything was falling into place perfectly. Preston was handling the personal destruction. It was almost amusing to watch him spiral, to watch him beg for her help, and she would handle the systematic dismantling of Vivien Wells. One false claim at a time. One bureaucratic nightmare led upon another. By the time the week ended, Vivien would have lost her apartment, her custody of her daughter, her job, and her will to continue fighting. It would look clean, legitimate, legal. The world would see a poor woman who could not manage her own life, a mother unfit for custody, a tenant unable to pay rent. What Margaret did not know was that at that exact moment, Giovanni Valenti's people were moving through Philadelphia like ghosts. At midnight, FBI agents in dark windbreakers surrounded Preston Mercer's apartment building. They came through the door at 12:41 a.m. with warrants so thorough, so damning, that Preston's screams could be heard 3 floors down. Embezzlement across 6 years. Tax fraud spanning 3 restaurants. Records of every penny he had stolen from waitresses like Vivien, detailed documentation of every threat he had made, every shift he had docked without pay. He was dragged from his apartment in sweatpants and no shirt, his face bloated with alcohol and panic, collapsing like a wounded animal when the cameras found him. By dawn, federal charges had been filed. By the end of the month, he had received 40 years without parole. No deals. No mercy. No possibility of escape. Margaret Harrington learned about Preston's arrest from her lawyer at 8 a.m. She felt a small twinge of something, regret, perhaps, that she had not secured her own exit strategy more carefully, but the feeling passed quickly. She had survived worse than this. She had connections that ran deeper than one disgraced restaurant manager. That evening, she attended the philanthropy gala at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She wore Chanel, natural pearls, hair styled to perfection. She smiled at the mayor, laughed with the city council president, moved through the room like she had always owned it. The ballroom gleamed with gold and crystal. String quartets played something classical and mournful. At 8:33 p.m., the screens flickered. Every screen in the ballroom, the displays that usually showed auction items and donation tiers, suddenly blazed with video. Margaret watched her own face appear, recorded, her own voice emerging from the speakers. The CPS office is run by an idiot. We can slip false reports through there without any real investigation. I've done it twice before. I'll do it again if it'll clear that slut out of the building. The room went absolutely silent. Like a coffin lid closing. Like the sky before a hurricane. Like the world holding its breath before it falls. More screens. More video. Margaret's embezzlement from the Children's Fund, $340,000 over 7 years. Her bribery of city officials with recorded conversations, cell phone audio, documented payments. Her connections to a trafficking ring that had used her restaurants as fronts for exploitation, names of victims, dates, amounts. Everything. Everything. Her allies began moving away from her like she was contagious, like her corruption could transfer through proximity. The mayor's face had gone white. The city council president was already talking to someone on his phone, his voice urgent and low. Margaret tried to run. The ballroom had become a maze of turning backs and disapproving faces. She reached the doors, and police were already coming through them, state police, federal agents, detectives in dark suits with warrants and handcuffs. She did not make it to the hallway. She was taken in front of everyone, in front of every person she had cultivated for 30 years, in front of every connection she had built and weaponized and relied upon. Federal charges, 42 counts. Asset seizure, total. Her empire did not crumble. It simply vanished, like smoke, like a curse finally lifted. Vivien watched it all from the mansion's guest house, sitting beside Sophie on a bed that felt like clouds. Her daughter was asleep against her shoulder, exhausted from the day, from the sudden move, from the strangeness of everything. On the television screen, Margaret Harrington's face appeared again and again as news outlets replayed the gala footage. Is it wrong that I don't feel bad? Vivien whispered into the darkness. Giovanni stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light. He had changed from his suit into something simpler, dark slacks and a black shirt with the top buttons undone, showing the edge of his chest. The scar on his face caught the light at an angle that made him look less like a man and more like a monument to survival. "They hurt people for years," Vivien continued, her voice barely audible. "They hurt me. They tried to take my daughter. Darkness for darkness for darkness. Over and over." Giovanni moved into the room with the careful tread of someone entering a sacred space. He sat on the edge of the bed, his weight causing the mattress to dip slightly, causing Sophie to shift and murmur in her sleep but not wake. His hand reached out slowly and touched Vivien's shoulder with a gentleness that contradicted everything his body had been built to express. "Darkness cannot drive out darkness," he said quietly. "But sometimes justice requires a light bright enough to expose every shadow. And you, Vivien, are that light." She turned her head to look at him. In the television's blue glow, she could see every line of his face, every mark of the 5 years he had spent feeling nothing. He was looking at Sophie, the child who would grow up safe now, who would never wonder if her mother was going to leave her, who would never stand on a bridge and do the mathematics of erasure. "What happens now?" Vivien asked. Giovanni's hand remained on her shoulder. "Now we heal. Not quickly. Not easily. But together." Outside, Philadelphia slept. The snow had stopped falling. The city lights reflected off the wet streets like 1,000 tiny promises, like the world saying it was possible to survive, to rise, to become something other than what circumstance had tried to make you. Vivien leaned her head against Sophie's, feeling the warmth of her daughter's breath, and for the first time in 5 years, she believed it. 3 weeks had passed since the television cameras stopped running, since Preston Mercer's face disappeared from every screen in Philadelphia, since Margaret Harrington's name became synonymous with corruption in the city's highest circles. The snow had melted. The cold October air had warmed into something almost bearable. And Vivien Wells stood in front of a mirror in a room with 3 windows, a room with walls that did not echo with the sounds of neighbors' arguments, a room that belonged to her. Her hands were healing. The calluses on her palms, earned through 10,000 hours of scrubbing marble floors that were not hers, were finally fading into pale lines like old scars. She touched her own face in the mirror, really touched it, studying the person looking back. Her hair, washed with water that came hot from the tap without hesitation, fell in waves to her shoulders. She was wearing a cream-colored dress, fitted at the waist, made from fabric soft enough to make her skin believe it was being treated with kindness. The dress cost $300. She knew this because Giovanni had told her while placing it on the bed in her room, and she had felt something break open inside her chest at the number, at the casual way he had moved through the world where $300 was the price of a single piece of cloth. Behind her, the door to Sophie's bedroom stood open. Through the gap, she could see her daughter curled on a bed with a white duvet, surrounded by 7 stuffed animals arranged in a careful circle, a barrier against nightmares that had stopped coming 3 weeks ago. Sophie's breathing was deep and even, the breathing of a child who no longer woke at 3 a.m. listening for footsteps, for angry voices, for the sound of doors being slammed in rage. The knock on the guest house door came soft and measured, Giovanni's way of announcing himself without demanding entry. Vivien turned from the mirror and moved down the hallway to answer it. The evening air carried the smell of spring blooming on the mansion grounds, magnolia and wet earth and something green and alive. Giovanni stood in the doorway wearing a suit of dark grey linen, his white shirt open at the collar. His eyes, which 5 weeks ago had been the color of a winter sky, held something different now, something like warmth, or the memory of warmth, or the possibility that warmth could exist in a body built for violence. He carried a small velvet box in one hand. "Sophie is asleep?" he asked. His voice was steady, solid, the voice of a man who asked questions knowing the answer already. 20 minutes ago, Vivien said. She asked if you would read to her tomorrow morning. She chose a book about a dragon who was afraid of the dark. Something flickered across his face. In the 15 years that Marco had served Giovanni Valenti, Marco had never seen his boss's expression change at the mention of a child. Marco did not know about the dragon book. Marco did not know that Giovanni had spent the last 3 nights learning to pronounce each word correctly, that he had stood outside Sophie's door practicing the sound of his own voice made gentle, learning a language he had forgotten, the language of hope spoken to someone small enough to believe it. "I will be there," Giovanni said. He extended the velvet box toward her. "This is for you." Vivien did not move to take it. She had learned, over these 3 weeks, that accepting gifts from Giovanni Valenti required more than just reaching out. It required understanding that every gift was weighted with meaning, that nothing he gave was casual, that he did not perform the gestures of affection lightly. The box sat in the space between them like a question nobody had asked yet. "Open it," he said quietly. Inside the box, resting on white silk, was a ring. The band was white gold, twisted in an intricate pattern like vines, like something growing and living. The stone was a diamond that caught the light from the hallway and transformed it into something holy, something that seemed to contain entire universes of light within its geometry. On either side of the diamond, smaller stones were set in a pattern that reminded Vivien of scattered stars. "I told you that giving everything you had to a stranger could save 2 lives, Giovanni said. His hand reached out and gently touched the side of her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with the careful attention of an archaeologist studying something precious and fragile. "It saved Marco's brother. It saved you. It saved me, although I did not know I needed saving. I was dead, Vivien. I had killed everything inside myself that could feel, could hope, could want something other than power. And then you stood in the cold with no coat, with $5 in your pocket, and you gave those dollars to a dying man. You taught me that survival is not the same as living." The tears came quickly, surprising her. Vivien had learned not to cry over the years. Tears were a luxury, a waste of water and energy that her body could not afford. But in this hallway in a mansion where 3 weeks ago she had scrubbed marble floors as if she were part of the furniture, she found that her body remembered how to break open. The tears fell hot down her cheeks. "Vivien Wells," Giovanni said, and his voice held something like ceremony, like the weight of vows being made. "Will you marry me?" She did not answer with words. Instead she held out her left hand, watching as he slid the ring onto her 4th finger. It fit perfectly, settling against her skin like it had been waiting for her all along. The diamond caught the light again and threw it back into the darkness of the hallway, a small constellation of brightness in the place where a maid and a Mafia boss stood making promises that would change the shape of both their lives. From Sophie's room came the sound of shifting blankets, a small murmur, the noise a child makes in the deepest part of sleep. Giovanni's hand found Vivien's and held it, their fingers interlaced, his expensive watch pressing cool against her wrist. "She asked me yesterday if forever is possible," Vivien said softly. "She asked if people can really stay in one place and not leave. I told her that nothing lasts forever, that sometimes you have to take things one day at a time. But I think I was wrong. Forever is possible," Giovanni said. "It becomes possible the moment you decide that surviving is not enough anymore, that you want to actually live. You taught me that. You are still teaching me." They stood in the doorway as the night deepened, as the city lights of Philadelphia flickered on in the distance like fireflies, like hopes, like the accumulated brightness of millions of small moments choosing to continue. The smell of magnolia grew stronger as a breeze moved through the grounds, carrying the season's promise, that winter always ends, that ice always thaws, that spring always comes eventually to even the coldest places. At exactly that moment, 8 miles away, in a prison cell in the Federal Detention Center, Preston Mercer pressed his forehead against the small window in his door and watched the other inmates walk past. His orange jumpsuit hung on him like a shroud. He would be 47 when he was released, if he lived that long in a place where men with nothing left to lose had very little reason to hesitate. Margaret Harrington was in a different facility, in a different state, her socialite connections turned to ash, her bank accounts frozen, her name in every newspaper as a cautionary tale about the cost of cruelty dressed up as privilege. The empire she had built on lies was collapsing in slow motion, one defection at a time, one lawsuit at a time, one victim stepping forward to tell their story at a time. But in the guest house on the Valenti mansion grounds, none of this mattered anymore. What mattered was the ring on Vivien's finger catching the lamplight. What mattered was Giovanni's hand in hers. What mattered was the sound of Sophie's breathing from the next room, steady and safe and full of sleep without nightmares. 6 months later, Vivien stood in the office of Valenti Enterprises, the legitimate division, the empire being rebuilt into something that did not require violence to survive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Philadelphia's skyline. Her desk held a computer, a telephone, and a single-framed photograph, Sophie at her school's spring festival, her gap-toothed smile enormous, her whole body bright with the simple joy of being alive and safe and loved. Beside the photograph sat a smaller frame containing 2 objects, the eviction notice with its red ink deadline, faded now, a relic of a time when $5 meant survival, and a prayer card, worn soft at the edges, that had belonged to Giovanni's mother decades ago. Giovanni entered without knocking. In 6 months, he had not killed anyone. Marco had noted this fact with the kind of awe usually reserved for witnessing miracles. The boss had not eliminated rivals. He had not ordered retaliation. Instead, he had sat in boardrooms and negotiated, had signed contracts, had built something that did not require blood to sustain it. This transformation shocked everyone who knew him, and it terrified Giovanni Valenti himself, the terror of a man who had spent years believing that the monster inside him was the only true thing, only to discover that the man could change, could choose different, could build something other than empires of fear. "The adoption papers are ready," he said, placing a document on her desk. "Sophie's name will be legally changed to Sophie Valenti if you agree. She asked me this morning if that meant she could call me Papa. I told her to wait and ask you first, because decisions that big belong to both of us now." Vivien read the first line of the adoption petition. Her hands, steady now, did not tremble. The calluses were gone. She was a woman who wore dresses that cost money, who had an office with a view, who was loved by a man powerful enough to reshape the world and gentle enough not to. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer nobody. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it." That evening, they stood at the iron gates where everything had begun, where Vivien had given her last $5 to a dying man on a night of bitter cold and wind that cut like a blade through her borrowed coat. The season had changed completely. It was warm now, the kind of warm that speaks of growth, of things being born. The gates stood open, no guards visible, because Giovanni no longer needed guards to keep people out. He needed nothing from anyone except the woman beside him and the child who ran across the mansion lawn toward them both, her school uniform abandoned for a red dress, her laughter carrying across the grounds like bells. Sophie crashed into Vivien's legs, then reached up to grab Giovanni's hand. The 3 of them stood together in the amber light of evening, the city skyline rising behind them, the future mapped out in a language they were all learning to speak for the first time, the language of people who had survived and chosen to live, who had been broken and chosen to heal, who had been alone and chosen family. "What did you learn today, Sophie?" Giovanni asked, and his voice contained all the gentleness he had forgotten how to access, all the humanity that one act of mercy had restored. "I learned that colors can be happy or sad," Sophie said seriously. "And Miss Chen said that the saddest color is blue. But it is also the color of the sky and the ocean, and those are beautiful. So I think maybe sadness and beauty live in the same place." Giovanni and Vivien exchanged a look that required no words. In the mouth of a 7-year-old child who had survived abuse and abandonment, who had learned to flinch at sudden movements, who now laughed without permission or fear, in this child was the moral of everything. Sadness and beauty lived in the same place. Darkness and light could coexist in a single heart. A person could be destroyed by the world and then remade by a single act of kindness, a single moment of choosing to see someone, to believe in someone, to love someone despite everything. If this story moved you, if it made you believe that mercy still matters, that one person's kindness can change everything, then please, drop a like on this video. Share it with someone who needs to remember that darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only love can do that. Subscribe to our channel because tomorrow we are bringing you another story about the moment everything changes, the instant when a person chooses kindness and the world shifts on its axis. What would you have done if you had $5 left and found a dying stranger? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and your words matter more than you know. Thank you for staying with us. We wish you peace, health, and days filled with light. Goodbye, and we will see you again tomorrow.